Hello folks! In this micro lecture, I'm going to explain what a proper exposure is and the three camera settings that control exposure. A proper exposure is the most fundamental and essential skill you must learn as a photographer to make great images. Let's start by defining what exposure is. Exposure is the amount of light which reaches your camera's sensor or film. The three settings that control this are the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. When we talk about a normal or proper exposure, it would be assigned an exposure value of 0, like in this image. And what that means is across the entire image, there are details in the shadows, details in the midtones, and details in the highlights. In an image that's overexposed, or too much light has reached the sensor, it might be assigned a value of 2 stops overexposed in this case, and you can see the overall image is too light, the shadows aren't dark enough, and there's no highlight details. Conversely, if an image is underexposed, which means not enough light hit the sensor, the overall image is too dark. We can't see any detail in the shadows, and even our highlights are too dark. Let's remember that a normal or proper exposure does not mean a perfect exposure. It's very rare that we get an exposure where the entire image has the exact right amount of light in both the shadows and the highlights. Next, we'll look at what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are, what they control on the camera, and how they affect your exposure. We'll start with ISO. The general rule of thumb in photography is you want to shoot with the lowest ISO for the lighting conditions and shooting situations that you're in. The ISO is how sensitive the camera is to light. The brighter it is out, the lower the ISO that you can use. And conversely, the darker it is, the higher your ISO will need to be for you to be able to make a proper exposure. Once you set the ISO, it's unlikely that you'll need to change it unless your lighting conditions change while you're in the middle of your shoot. It's important to note that if you use a really high ISO, you're going to get digital noise in your images. Think about when you take a photo on your cell phone in low light. You get all those orange and green pixels in the image. That's why we try to use the lowest ISO for the shooting conditions we're in. Next up is the aperture. Aperture is the amount of light that is allowed through the iris of the lens to hit the sensor. Aperture is also referred to as the f-stop, hence the F in front of the numbers. As we open our aperture up, it's important to note the number actually gets smaller. So f2.8 is letting in a lot of light through the lens, while f16 is letting very little light in through the lens. The aperture also controls something else called depth of field. Depth of field is how much of your image is in focus in front of and behind the subject you have focused on. As you increase the aperture to f2.8, you have less depth of field. And as you decrease the aperture down to like f16, you'll have much more depth of field. We'll learn about depth of field in another lecture. The last setting we need to learn about is the shutter speed. That's the length of time light is hitting the sensor. Shutter speed is also used to stop motion. The faster the subject is moving, the faster the shutter speed needs to be. Shutter speed has a huge range. People that do nighttime photography can take exposures that are several hours long. Someone shooting sports might use a very fast shutter speed of a 5,000th of a second in order to freeze action. Think about a photo of a helicopter where the blades are perfectly stopped. That was done with a fast shutter speed. Now that we know what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are, and how they affect the camera's ability to capture light, let's look at how we use them to get a proper exposure. Our cameras come with a built-in light meter which measures the amount of light that is reaching the camera sensor. We use the light meter to adjust our settings and get a proper exposure. I have set my ISO to 200 and my aperture is set to 5.6. I will use the light meter to measure the light reaching the sensor and adjust my shutter speed until the light meter is as close to the center as possible. To do this, press the shutter release button halfway to activate the light meter. When I press the shutter halfway down, you'll notice this arrow has appeared underneath the light meter. That's letting me know that right now the camera is letting in more than 3 stops too much light. My shutter speed is currently at 1/40th of a second, a relatively slow shutter speed. To get a proper exposure, that means I'm going to have to increase my shutter speed to let in less light. I'm going to increase my shutter speed until I get the dot on the light meter to line up with the 0 EV value in the center of the meter. In this case, it's 1/640th of a second. This will give me a proper exposure for the scene I am shooting. In conclusion, a proper exposure is absolutely important to a photographer making great photos. Remember, exposure is the combination of ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed, and the use of the camera's onboard light meter to make sure that all 3 of those settings are working together to get a proper exposure. Following the steps in this lecture should help you to get your own proper exposure and take your own great shots.